Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Idaho Falls Symphony's pre-concert talk for our Baroque Elegance program coming up on Thursday night, December 10th. I am so glad to be joined for this pre-concert talk by our little panel here. And of course, behind the scenes, Alexandria Pugh and Joe Groh getting our production off the ground here. Thanks to you all behind the scenes as well. And welcome again to the first, I'm going to mute my microphone. See, we're live here. Things just seem to be happening. This is very exciting. Joined by Dr. Robert Tueller here. Dr. Tueller is currently the principal cellist of the Idaho Falls Symphony. Robert directs the BYU Idaho Symphony Orchestra and the University Baroque Ensemble. He holds a doctorate in early music performance from University of Southern California and was formerly principal cellist with the Los Angeles Baroque Orchestra, among others. We also have Ellen Marquez here. Ellen is currently the orchestra librarian of the Idaho Falls Symphony, as she has a bachelor's degree in early music, a recorder performance from the Early Music Institute of Indiana University, where she also completed her master's of library science. And we also were joined by violinist Emma Rubenstein. She is, of course, the concertmaster of the Idaho Falls Symphony since 2009. She holds a Master of Music from Yale University. And in addition to an extensive teaching career, she's also a background in orchestral playing, solo performances, and extensive background in chamber music, having been first violinist for two critically acclaimed string quartets. So we are so grateful to have such a great group of people here at the Idaho Falls Symphony, and so grateful to have you all on. Hello. Just to get things started, I'm going to let our audiences in on the background here of this interesting concert we have coming up for you Thursday. We were all just commenting before we came on about how tonight would have been the first rehearsal for Handel's Messiah this week, coming up December the 10th as well. That, of course, was canceled long ago, and we refashioned the program as we refashioned the whole series of concerts this year to be safe and keep our audiences safe and to have smaller ensembles due to the pandemic. We had another entire program created, this Baroque Elegance program, that was going to be a smaller ensemble featuring our principal oboist playing an oboe concerto and a number of other works for Baroque orchestra. That program in the 11th hour also had to be scrapped. We went into sort of the highest restriction orders on the day before we were going to meet as an ensemble. We were not able to meet. And so what we've done is we've actually refashioned the program a third time to feature stay-at-home recordings by many of the musicians that were already signed up for this performance. So the program has changed now many, many times, but what we will have on Thursday night is still a concert that features this wonderful Baroque repertoire. And it's a really great opportunity for us in a season called Fast Forward to kind of pause and take this look backwards at what at the time were really revolutionary changes going on in music, and that really was a really fast pace of change going on in the late 17th, early 18th century. It's a fascinating time period that we're going to get into here. So we'll tell you first about the program and what it has in store. We begin with the second partita of Johann Sebastian Bach, the Allemande movement, played by Ariel Loveland, our principal second violinist. We move to the Vivaldi Sonata No. 5 in E minor by Vivaldi, by Vivaldi. And that's Robert playing with his daughter, Claire Thuesen. She is there. They are the only ones who performed in a duet because they are in the same household. And some of the other ensembles were actually mashups that we did with post-production videos. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight and Thursday. We have a number of works by Georg Philipp Telemann on this program, a canon, which our principal violist Lisa McNiven played with herself. It's a two-part canon where she plays both voices thanks to the video technology. It's very cool. And Emma plays two fantasies by Telemann that we'll talk a little bit about. So that's our first half. We then go have a short intermission and come back, and Lisa McNiven returns to play the viola concerto of Telemann, with Robert and Claire providing the accompaniment in a virtual mashup of the three musicians. Another great testament to how this season has made us better at technology in so many ways. And we end with, again, Robert playing the first cello suite of Johann Sebastian Bach, arguably the most popular of his 6 cello suites, solo cello suites. So just, again, so much music on this program, so much to unpack. And we want to, as we do for these pre-concert talks, give you a little bit of historical information. I'm going to bring in my colleagues for this discussion about who these great composers were. And just to give you a sense, it's astonishing to me, but with the inclusion of Handel, all of these composers were writing in virtually the exact same window of time, roughly the 1670s through 1750, the death of Johann Sebastian Bach, or just a little bit later in the case of Handel and Telemann. It's just amazing to think of the quantity of music that was being produced at that time and consumed by the public in these various parts of Europe. We begin the conversation with Vivaldi, the Italian composer, probably the most well-renowned in his lifetime. This was a musician that reached great fame in his composing and performance career. Vivaldi, a great violinist, evidently couldn't play wind instruments due to asthma. I thought that was an interesting thing, but he really mastered string instruments and was also an ordained priest. So a lot of his work was in the church setting. He wrote a number of these sonatas, and that is, of course, one of the genres we'll pull apart here. That was a sort of ecclesiastical church music, instrumental music for the church at the time. Vivaldi, though, so much literature, so much great string writing. Of course, his Four Seasons of Vivaldi, this is one of the most important works in the violin repertoire, 4 different solo concertos representing the 4 seasons. That was performed, composed relatively late in his career in the 1720s and 30s, as were these sonatas, many of them coming from that same era of Vivaldi's output. So again, born in Venice, very much thriving in Venice, a product of the Venetian culture, eventually trying to make his way over to Germany, where all of these other famous composers were thriving. Robert, let me bring you into the conversation here when we talk about Telemann. How does he relate?
Telemann's a lot like Vivaldi in his popularity. He was incredibly well appreciated in his time. In fact, that's one thing we were surprised about, because we consider Bach such a big name, and he was relatively obscure compared to a Telemann and Vivaldi, who were highly celebrated. And really, one of the reasons we know this is because of the amount of publishing that Vivaldi and Telemann did. Because publishing your works was really expensive, and a publisher wouldn't produce these works to sell unless they knew they had a big name that they could sell. And Telemann published extensively through his life, so we know he was very popular. We almost didn't have a musician, Telemann. Apparently, when he was younger, he was forbidden to study and to do music by his mother. His father died when he was quite young. She wanted him to become a lawyer. And he was shipped off to Leipzig University to study law. But all along, he had been studying music and composing. Apparently, he even wrote an opera at age 12, which we don't have. But he wound up making money successfully in Leipzig in all the composing that he did, and made that career full-time. In addition to learning a variety of instruments, organ, violin, wind instruments, Telemann was very multi-instrumental, and that shows in his music. And so Telemann, made his living primarily composing, and this is kind of different for us to think about, but he worked for different cities, which included civic events, civic responsibilities, and church responsibilities too. One of the main cities he worked in was in Frankfurt, which meant that he composed not only for the city, but he composed for the 5 major churches as well. He was a busy man, because history remembers him as the most prolific composer of all time. More than 3,000 works, we think, though not all of them exist, and certainly not all of his music has ever been played. So Telemann's amazing that way, both in his popularity and the prolific output.
That's incredible. 3,000 works. The fame of Johann Sebastian Bach writing more music than you could write in a lifetime. I think that Telemann might have given him a run for his money.
Yeah, and interesting, when you mentioned that these composers all worked at the same time, Telemann and Bach knew each other well. They were good friends. Bach's oldest son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, Telemann was his godfather.
Right.
And Carl Philipp Emanuel followed Telemann in a job and later on in Telemann's life. They knew each other well. Handel and Telemann were friends as well.
It's incredible. It's just such an amazing period. And of course, we would like to include in the conversation the great Johann Sebastian Bach. His works really, I think, epitomize the Baroque period is for no other reason than just the ingenuity and genius of his counterpoint. I think there's few other composers that really had his ability to craft counterpoint, fugue, all of these other, very technical devices in such an artful way. He's really able to make music at every single opportunity. But going back to his early life, he's really someone who comes out of very little, orphaned as a child, and trying to figure out the path that he would take. And music, playing the organ, was clearly it. We are just blessed to have his music. But the trajectory is astonishing to me. For you were mentioning with Telemann, city to city, Bach lived very much the same life. This was a composer who had works commissioned and expected of him every single week at different institutions. The pace at which he could write these cantatas, the different instrumental works, it's astounding. And so, Robert, with Bach, where do we really point to as his greatest success? It's so vast.
Oh, that's just it. His music is, he really, I guess I think of Bach as creating the best of the old world, where, Telemann, and even to a limited extent Handel, they were sort of looking forward. Telemann was pushing into these newer styles, which would ultimately become the classical era. And Bach, in his lifetime, was maybe considered a little old-fashioned. But as a result of doing that so well, history remembers him as really the pinnacle of composers of that style, I think. But it really was because he looked backwards and did what history did best,
And the famous story, of course, of Bach's resurgence thanks to Felix Mendelssohn finding the score for the Matthew Passion, and the fact that was, this bringing to light of the old, and in this romantic context. I love that story because it's sort of like what we do. I feel like every time we play a piece by Bach, there's always this discovery. And I'm sure Emma and Ellen, as performers, you would agree that it's limitless in what you can find in the works of Bach, expression-wise, in terms of interpretation. And we're going to get into a lot of those details. Before we do, I want to also let folks know who are able to watch this live on our YouTube and Facebook pages, the comments, we can bring some of your comments into the conversation. So if you have something you'd like to ask any of us, please put it in the comments, and our folks behind the scenes, Alec and Joe, can put some of those questions up there, and we'll just have those questions be a part of the conversation. So here we are in the High Baroque, and I guess what I wanted to ask all of you is, what was the first time that you had? What does this term early music mean to you? You all have this early music background. Baroque music, especially in this High Baroque period, isn't even really early music when you are as historically informed as you all are. When did you first sort of hear this term? What does it mean to you? And how did you go about learning the style? What is your particular background? And Ellen, I would love to start with you because, the recorder is very much an early music instrument with not a lot of sort of contemporary repertoire written for the instrument. What was your path in the early music world?
Yes. So for me, it really started from the very beginning. We moved to Indiana when I was a young kid, actually for my mother to do her doctorate in harpsichord and early keyboard performance at Indiana University in the Early Music Institute there as well. And so for me, since I can remember, my mom has been doing early music and performing and studying it. And she did her dissertation on French Baroque theory treatises. So for me, ever since I can remember, it was a part of my life, and I remember hearing her play and her colleagues play. And once we moved to Indiana there, she met the pre-college recorder teacher affiliated with the university, and that's when my brothers and I started taking recorder lessons, and they played for a while and dropped it after some time. I continued on, and in high school I was pretty much beyond the pre-college program, what they could give me, and so I started studying my sophomore year with a professor at the university there, recorder professor Abel Lejeune, and I did my bachelor's degree, as you mentioned, Thomas, and was really immersed in it. There are things like performance practice before 1750, recorder lessons, chamber music, recorder consorts, early music ensembles, Baroque orchestra, all of these things when they needed recorder. I had to do harpsichord proficiency in place of piano for early music and secondary cornetto lessons. That was a lot of fun. And then, of course, all the theory and history and things required for a degree. Um, so I really dove into it deeply in my bachelor's degree, but my entire life, I guess, has been influenced by early music because I'm second generation early musician and graduate from the Early Music Institute. So
That's amazing. So for you then, for this term early music, then you mentioned, performance practice before 1750, and that's that famous date, the death of Bach, when we kind of draw this historical line. How far into early did your research take you? I mean, are we talking all the way back to the 10th century or?
So most of what we did in the Early Music Institute was focused on medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque music. So I did play a great deal on medieval replica instruments, which is really interesting, and then actual Renaissance replica instruments, and then of course the Baroque, more advanced instruments that had evolved over time. And so, pre-medieval music, it gets a little tricky there. There's nothing written down really. They found instruments, but that's about it, recorders and things, and various flutes. But I played a great deal of medieval music all the way through the Baroque. And the interesting thing is that the recorder sort of died out at the end of the Baroque and into classical. It became less popular, and the traverso, or the precursor to the modern flute, became more popular and took over. But in the early 20th century, the recorder sort of made a comeback, and so there's a lot of new music that's actually been composed in the 1900s for the recorder by these composers who are sort of bringing it back, a lot of which I played as well in my degree. But so it's a really interesting how it's the early music and then a great deal of interesting new music has been attributed to the instrument.
So we actually are right in. Fast forward is appropriate here. Then to think of that era as having all those changes. We're going to talk about some of those technical changes on the instruments and maybe get a demo out of you. We've got some demonstrations from Emma as well, a video we want to play just to get into this contrast and to see how these changes evolved. Emma, same question to you. So what was your introduction to this early music genre, and how did you go about learning the style?
Well, my start, I heard early music performance, when I was in high school and when I studied my undergraduate degree in Boston, but there was a program in Boston, but I would attend concerts, but I did not play, but I had an affinity for it. And as I was working on my master's at Yale, Jaap Schroeder was on the faculty there. And he's a very famous, passed away actually just this year, but a very famous Dutch early music enthusiast and, protagonist. And so I studied Baroque period music and classical period music with him, but on, the modernized violin, not with Baroque equipment. And but I learned so much from him that always remained in my ear. And during my years playing in quartet, especially when I was based in California, the quartet, we really experimented a lot with music of Bach, and also the Haydn quartets where we kind of played it in sort of an early music style. But my introduction to really playing Baroque violin came when I went to Oberlin Conservatory and participated in the Oberlin Baroque Performance Institute and studied with Marilyn McDonald. And, that was my first really diving into using the Baroque period instrument. And it just seemed like the right, so that was about 25 years ago. And so, I guess I'm later to the game than Ellen, but it just seemed like the right evolution for me because I've always been drawn to it. And even in my teaching of, Baroque music, I teach it with a very, not a very, contemporary romantic sense, but in a very sort of Baroque style way. And I guess it's the way I learned it. And, it just speaks to me. And so, you know, just trying to stay active when I could with the Baroque violin, and also my experience when I was teaching up at BYU, Idaho, and meeting Robert and playing with Robert. I feel like I've learned a lot from Robert as well. So I consider him one of my Baroque mentors, and, you know, enjoying, you know, working with him whenever I can.
Well, and that, of course, was my thinking with having Robert as our guest conductor for, would have been Handel's Messiah, would have been the Baroque Elegance program. Robert's still been instrumental in this program. So, Robert, for you, you're coming at it now from the cello. You have the Baroque cello degree. And then, you know, what Emma was saying about applying practice principles to modern groups and how it involves in your teaching. So what's been your sort of journey with this early music genre?
Well, mine actually happened when I was a master's student. I had finished a cello performance degree, and I was headed to the University of Southern California to do my master's with the conductor there, Daniel Lewis. And when my first meeting with Daniel, he sat me down and he said, "These are the requirements for the conducting degree, but I want you to ignore these. Instead, I want you to focus on the best professors in our program. And you need to get to know a man by the name of James Tyler, who was just starting the early music program at USC. And James was a big part of the London early music group back in the early 70s, and a highly recorded lute player back in the day, and very instrumental in some of that earliest. You know, some of his colleagues were people like Christopher Hogwood and David Monroe and people like that. And so I introduced myself to James, and I joined the early music group and started playing Baroque cello there. And I took some of his classes, and it was a real eye-opening experience for me. And in addition to that, there was another person in Los Angeles that had a lot of influence on me, the director of the Los Angeles Baroque Orchestra, a violinist by the name of Greg Maldonado. He taught at USC adjunct, and I would come in and accompany some of the violin students, you know, provide them a bass line on cello, on the Baroque cello. And after getting to know me, he gave me a call and invited me to join the orchestra. And so I started playing professionally down there regularly too. And it really opened my eyes to the, you know, playing opportunities, experiences, and the music style. So it was a great opportunity. So for me, early music, actually, it's kind of instrument dependent for me. With James, I actually play lute. I studied lute with him. And so we're talking about Renaissance music, viola da gamba also I play. And then I worked in through the Baroque with my Baroque cello playing. And the Los Angeles Baroque Orchestra in their repertoire went on into Mozart and Haydn, Beethoven. I've even done a Mendelssohn symphony with them on Baroque instruments. So that kind of what I think of as early music is using those instruments which are patterned after earlier models. So that was my experience.
Yeah. And so you have now up in Rexburg, BYU Idaho's Baroque Ensemble, the University Baroque Ensemble. You guys do have the hardware, right? You have a whole set of instruments that are Baroque instruments.
They're patterned after Baroque models, which are just slightly different. I'm sure that we'll talk about that at some point. There's several good makers in the United States, and we were lucky enough to have the school supported us to commission an orchestra full of instruments, and we do that regularly with the students. So we don't offer a degree in early music. It's not really practical since I'm the only one there, but that does that. But they use that as a part of their study, and I think it's been a really rich experience for those students.
We love to hear it. And as Emma mentioned, you know, it really is, it's a force in the community. I think it has done so much to develop this sense of style. So those are the two things that we really want to pick apart is, what is this Baroque style? How do you figure it out? How do you internalize it and make it part of your performance vocabulary as players? And also these hardware upgrades. What were the sort of evolving, the modern tendencies of these instruments? So Ellen, I'll just go back to you there. Do you have an instrument to show? Is it a size thing? Is there a...
I do. So do you want me to just dive in about...
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so to start out, I have a Renaissance soprano, or styled after a Renaissance soprano. And so in a gist, Renaissance music is quite simple and very ensemble driven. And so medieval instruments were even more rudimentary, but this still, as you can see, it's very simple and straight. If you look inside, if you could see all the way down here, Renaissance instruments actually have large bores, which means the air or space inside of the instrument is quite large, and the bore is very straight, so it's the same size all the way through the instrument. It's a very simple instrument. It's what we call quarter comma mean tone. It's a tuning system that's very simple, used in the Renaissance, that actually, it sounds very good in C major, the key of C major, but the more accidentals you add, the harder it is to tune, and the more it sounds, ooh, you get the painful overtones. But it is, it's great for perfect fourths and perfect fifths and large Renaissance ensembles to blending together. The way it's built is actually, they sometimes have a bit of a bell at the bottom, but it's still straight inside. And so it's built to sound airier. It's earthier and has airier sound, and is about an octave and a half. So it's a quite limited range on this instrument. This particular one is actually in modern pitch. So pianos and modern instruments all sound at a pitch level called 440 hertz, so they all sound well together. But in the Renaissance, actually, pitch levels were all over the place. And so it was much more challenging to place different instruments together because they often weren't on the same pitch level or sound waves.
Now, forgive me for interrupting. Let me interrupt really quickly because Emma, she gave a demonstration of the two instruments, and we're going to get to that video in a moment. But actually, I'm curious if any of you know the driving factor behind the change of pitch. Robert, you're nodding your head. Is there?
I do.
An explanation?
It actually goes back to, well, as Ellen said, different regions had different pitch levels. I mean, there was no standard. And so they, when you built the local organ, it was at whatever pitch the organ builder pitched it at. And that often drove it. But actually this idea of 440, which is a modern idea in the last century, versus other pitch levels, 415 cycles per second would be a common one, which is the equivalent of our A flat.
A flat-ish, yeah.
From these wind instruments that exist, they know what pitches they played at, and from the organs that exist, because you can look at them and measure them.
Yeah, exactly. No, the dog is welcome, Emma. No shame.
But in France, we know that the court orchestra played at a level of 415. And that has become kind of a standard nowadays for recreating all this music. It kind of comes from that French orchestra. And the other thing that makes it practical is if you have a keyboard instrument, 415 is exactly a half step away from our standard 440. So you can make that instrument transposable by sliding. And so you can use it with modern groups and early groups. So that's where the 415s come from. I'm not sure that it's authentic to play instruments at low or high pitch, because A is whatever an A is. But
sure, yeah.
But that's why it happens that way.
Ellen, that gets us back to the next size in the team, right? So
yeah, I think so. It's all over the place. This particular one is at modern pitch, so it'll actually help. Now we'll go to my Baroque Alto. There's a handmade boxwood alto recorder that I use for playing Baroque music. You can see it there. So basically, when you go into the Baroque, as we talked about, the music is much more complex and virtuosic. It's solo music, much more complex than the Renaissance ensemble music. And so this particular recorder, just looking at it, you can see it's more refined and decorative. But it's also, if you look closely here, the Renaissance recorder is all single holes. So to get half steps and accidentals, you have to shade those well with your fingers, and that's something you do as a recorder player. And you still do that somewhat with the Baroque instrument, but you see we have double holes here, which make complex music and those accidentals much easier to play, especially when you're playing very intense virtuosic music. The bore that I talked about before is actually much narrower. There's a lot less air inside. It actually starts larger and tapers down smaller. And this build actually helps create a more piercing, clear, vibrant sound. And it's also increases the range to over 2 octaves. So you can play much more. So when you're playing virtuosic music, an octave and a half makes it quite difficult to play more fancy music. But So basically, the tuning system, the instrument, everything is more complex. There's more pieces, more holes. It's much more intricate. And this particular instrument, as we talked about, is at 415 hertz, approximately a half a step lower than modern pitch. Again, a lot of Baroque music at the time was at 415. And so here I'll give you a quick demonstration of a C at modern pitch on the Renaissance instrument. So you can hear it's airy, it has an airy, very good for blending ensembles. And then here's a C at the low pitch Baroque instrument.
So it's still a C. It's still a C. And actually, that is, thank you.
But it's sounding differently because the instrument is smaller, and the sound waves are sounding differently, but they're both a C. And then you can hear the more piercing, vibrant sound for solo music. And the last quick thing is that the recorder, as we talked about, it's an old instrument, but a lot of people, especially in North America, don't really know the background. However, a lot of the music composed in the Baroque that's played by modern flute or other instruments today was originally composed for the recorder specifically. Now, composers did change instruments and things sometimes, but Bach, Vivaldi, Telemann, Corelli, Murray, almost all of them composed quite a great deal of music for the recorder. When we talked about the Telemann fantasies, he composed a great deal of them for the recorder, and I played a lot of those in my programs and things. They're beautiful. And for example, the Bach cantata, Sheep May Safely Graze, for voice and two flutes, that was originally the recorder, so I played that a great deal as well. But there's a lot of music that we hear that was actually composed by the composer on the recorder originally, so in the early music period.
That is noteworthy. That is noteworthy. Thank you so much for the demo. That segues perfectly, Emma, into what you have provided for us. So with the recorder, obviously the instrument is fixed, whereas the string instruments, you guys, you have the ability to manipulate the pitch and change the pitch with the tuning of the strings. But Emma, it's the same setup basically in terms of what you talk about here in the video that we're going to play, in terms of the older instrument having an even airy sound with, and then the bow is a whole nother aspect that you talk about here. So it sounds like you and Ellen are talking about the same factors, just very different construction, right?
I think so. I mean, that was fascinating demonstration, Ellen. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so, and I think it's also important to remember that the instruments, sort of the performance practice, the Baroque fittings, it's like it wasn't a sudden transition. It evolved. And so there were bows that came in between, and they made modifications to the violin, and then they made more modifications. So it was a gradual process, in the development of the instrument or the modification of the instrument. So, that's, we get a little bit lost that, there were steps along the way, and we sort of look at it now as, well, this is how it was, but there were variations.
That is fascinating, and we'll get into that with you, Robert, with the cello and its growth. But Emma has made a video for us that is probably going to be part of our Thursday night as well, to give some of this historical background for audiences. So I know we have that queued up behind the scenes. It's about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you for that, Emma, very much. So we're going to switch over to that and be back with our panel here in just a moment. Thanks for watching.
My name is Emma Rubenstein, and I'm going to perform 2 works by Telemann this evening for solo violin. And I'm going to perform them on a Baroque style instrument. I wanted to take a few minutes to show you the difference between a modern instrument and a Baroque period instrument. So here on this side is my violin. And my violin was actually born in the Baroque period. It is a violin that was made in 1742 by an Italian, and but it has been modified since it was first made. And in this hand, I have a Baroque period style instrument. This one was actually built in 2011, and I am borrowing it from Dr. Robert Tueller and his Baroque program from BYU, Idaho. But it has the fittings of a Baroque period style. So let me just explain a few of the changes. So the violin family as we know it today was appeared in the early 16th century. And its basic form was set in the 17th century by luthiers Amati, Guarneri, and Stradivari. And in the early years, the neck of the instrument was wider and shorter, and the bridge is a little bit flatter. And the difference in creating a narrower neck, also there was a slight tilt of the fingerboard that was changed, and a rounder bridge in the modern instrument made for virtuoso playing that was going ever higher. So more notes are created with this, and also the brilliance of the instrument is greater. Concert halls were getting bigger, orchestras were getting larger, and it was necessary for soloists to be able to have more projection and more power. You'll also notice that on the Baroque style instrument, there is no chin rest. The chin rest was came to be in the early 19th century, and of course it made holding the instrument more comfortable, and also to allow more stability for the soloist so they could play ever more challenging music. And another change in the instrument is that of the strings. On the Baroque style instrument, we still use sheep gut strings that have a slightly mellower tone. And on the modern instrument, you know, especially in the 20th century, we started to use steel, aluminum, or nylon strings. So they have a little bit more bright quality, also then more power. Now, the sort of sum total of all of these older period fittings is that the tension point on the instrument is lower, therefore the pitch center is lower. And the modern instrument, we have a common universal tuning to 440 megahertz. That's the A string. And then on the modern instrument, we tune, because it has a lower tension point, we tune to 415 megahertz. That's the A on the Baroque period instrument, and that is about a half step lower. So along with changes to the violin also came some changes to the bow. This is a Baroque style bow. Again, it's a modern replica, and you can see that it has a convex curve and a very long and tapered tip. And so the playing properties of this bow is different than the modern bow. Now, the modern bow had various evolutions. It didn't go from this shape directly to this shape. There were bows that were sort of in between and that they were experimenting with. But the modern bow basically then developed its form, and it has this nice concave curve, less tapering of the tip, which allows there to be more sustain and more, again, projection in the sound. So before I started to start to play the selections on the Baroque instrument, I'd like to just play a few measures of my first selection with the modern instrument so you get a feel for the difference in tone between the two. So this is the first Telemann Fantasy in B flat major. I'll just be playing a few measures from the opening movement, which is Largo. the very same excerpt with the Baroque violin and bow. So in addition to the sound, of course, being very different sound world, the technique of playing the instrument and using the bow is a little bit different as well. But that's an introduction to the modern instrument and a Baroque period style instrument.
Thank you, Emma. Welcome back, everybody. Emma Rubinstein, concertmaster with the Idaho Falls Symphony, demonstrating these two instruments side by side. And Emma, for the recording of the Telemann Fantasies for Thursday night, you did play them on the Baroque instrument with the Baroque bow.
I did. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. And it was just so great to have Ellen as the prelude to that, because it's all the same things. It's the shorter, wider, going to the more narrow and focused for projection and virtuosity. I mean, a lot of these themes are clearly then tied into what the composers were doing. I mean, the instruments were adapting. Would you say, Emma, with the composers, or the composers driving the evolution of the instruments? It's kind of hard to say.
I can't say I know that for sure. I mean, I think it's, it was maybe both elements together. And also the fact that in the Baroque period, music was leaving just the salon or the church, and it was going into larger spaces. And so, I think the environment and the audience was changing and the circumstances were changing. And I think all of that kind of fed into this, relationship of evolution of the instrument, composers, composing more to the limit of the instrument, and the playing became more virtuosic. And so I defer to Robert,
I think you're right.
That, but I think it kind of all fed together.
Well, so, and Robert, so Emma at the end there was talking about then the use of the bow, articulation, and those sorts of things. So let's get into that a little bit with the cello. So when you talk about your playing of the viola da gamba and the Baroque cello and the modern cello, can you walk us through a little bit of the evolution of that? And please.
Well, I kind of think when I'm talking about early music, and particularly Baroque music specifically, I kind of think about two worlds that they were in that were kind of distinct and at opposite ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, they were very much interested in the rhythm of speech and the patterns of speech, rhetoric. That's the development of opera happened in the early Baroque era. It was just a way of trying to bring what they thought the Greeks did to light, to be able to move your audience with this speech patterns, impassioned speech making. And on the other end of the spectrum, the Baroque composers were super interested in rhythms of dance music, from popular dance music. And the two are kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum, where speech rhythms are very free and very impassioned, and that influences the way I would interpret a piece of Baroque music. And dance rhythms, well, you think about dancers, when you go down and come back up, strong beats and weak beats. So the idea of meter, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, or the concepts of strong and weak, down and up, those things go along with that music. So that they were very focused on the idea that important things happened on strong beats, and unaccented beats, or the beats where you're moving as a dancer, they propel you to the next down placement. And those two things kind of coexist together, and I'm always thinking of those two things when I'm playing early music.
Wonderful. And that
gets to passion speeches.
Yeah. That gets to, I mean, I'm thinking about rhetoric all the time too, no, I'm kidding, but it is true. And Emma, let me get to you. I just think that the dance form thing is something that we need to talk about, because when you look at Thursday night's playlist, we have suites, we have, there's the difference between a suite and a partita and all of these different things. Emma, what were you going to chime in with that?
Well, I was just going to say too, using the dance forms, which I think Bach sort of took to the extreme. He didn't mean for people to dance to his music necessarily, but the dance forms also, though, use different strong and weak beats. So I think what I concur with everything Robert said, but it's also very interesting. Like you have a sarabande that has a strong 1 and a strong 2, or a chaconne that has a strong 2, and that's in 3. So, I mean, the different dance forms allow for a lot of different variety in the playing and of the music, because, some are quick dance forms, some are more, elegant dance forms, so I just wanted to say that there are a lot of interesting ways of changing the stress on the music because of the particular dance form.
I actually have another point to make related to modern music. It's not really that different than nowadays. Kids don't listen to the radio anymore, right? So we couldn't say when you turn on your radio, when you pull up your Spotify playlist, when you're listening to popular music, you're essentially listening to dance-inspired rhythms of Latin, South American dances. And that's kind of prevailed in our modern popular music culture. And it was not that different back then. These European dances found their way into all of their music, whether it was meant to be danced to or not.
So now here's the question for the students of early music. Did you all learn the dances? I remember being asked this on the podium by a conducting teacher. Do you know how to waltz? That kind of thing. I mean, what about that? Have you guys experimented with these forms?
Well, I have taken classes in Baroque dance. If you were to ask me to do it now, I don't think I
You are not
would,
on the spot to do it now. Ellen,
right.
You were, yeah.
But yes, I mean, it was very interesting to learn a jig and very interesting to learn a sarabande, because the motions and the downs and the ups and, the way it feels, it really does inform the interpretation and the feel of the music.
Ellen, I agree. Ellen, go ahead.
Yes, it really helps you. So when I was studying my degree, they brought in, I can't remember her name now, but she's a very famous Baroque dancer to teach us, the Early Music Institute, all of us players, how to dance many of these dances. And it was really interesting how much more feeling we would put into the music and performing when we actually understood the dance and what we're trying to get at when you're actually dancing the dance. It really helped me to feel the performance of the dance much better. I mean, it was fine before, but when you actually are going through the motions of feeling that, it internalizes it quite a bit. So.
Well, what's also interesting here is, Baroque music and true of earlier Renaissance and medieval music, the instructions on the page for the performer are relatively minimal. There is not a lot of instruction on how to inflect, for example, a sarabande. There's nothing that necessarily tells you where those stress points should be. And so in a way, for our audience, is just to understand that the learning of those styles and those traditions and how to inflect this music is very much dependent on, as Ellen mentioned, instruction from dancers and just outside influences and the sort of oral tradition of what these things are. We learn that aspect of it because it is not, Robert, I would say, necessarily inherent in the printed music.
No, in fact, a Baroque composer, when they say sarabande, they've told you everything you need to know from their point of view.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's not much info.
there is a voicing thing though, because for instance, in the violin sarabandes, I'll take as, a lot of the strong, it's in a 3 meter. But with the strong 2, a lot of times you'd have a 3 or 4 note chord on beat 2. So you might have, so the way the music was, put, I guess, contrapuntally on the page, you might have a measure that, there is a vacant 2, and then you have measures where you have actually a 3 or a 4 note chord, which you have to roll. And so that it sort of is an impulse on that beat because of the sort of orchestration or the voicing, if you will. Which or a chaconne that begins on beat 2,
right,
where there is no 1. And so yes, a lot of it is tradition and a lot of it is understanding that. But I think, if you look at the voicing, that can also help with the interpretation. I just wanted to add one other little thing about the sonatas and partitas of the solo Bach. The partitas, like the suites of the cello, are all dance forms. And the sonatas, so they're sort of the secular tradition of music. And the sonatas, the solo sonatas, there are 3 of them in the collection of J.S. Bach. They're more highbrow, they're fugues, there's adagios, there's more serious slow movements, and the fugues, which was a more academic form. So those kind of arise from the church, side of music. And so my understanding of the suites is that they're all dance form related, whereas the 6 works we have for solo violin, 3 are the partitas, which are the dance forms, and 3 are the sonatas, which are not. So we have that kind of diversity within that collection of 6 sonatas and partitas for solo violin.
I do think it's really interesting when you look at these Baroque sonatas in the academic church form, that if you look at those last movements, they're very often in the rhythms of gigs, even though they don't call them gigs. Yes. They just call them allegro or something like that. So it's interesting. Still writing dance music, even in their church forms.
So we have to have a happy ending.
Yeah,
we have to have it always has to end right. And and Tchaikovsky figured out that you had to have a cymbal crash at the end in order to get applause. So it comes a long way. But Robert, let's go now to you're performing, in addition to the Vivaldi Sonata, sort of the intellectual church form work, the first suite of unaccompanied solo Bach cello suite. So what can you tell us about the performance that you've done for us this week, and as it relates to the other instrumental playing? We have an example of you playing on a Baroque cello, is that right?
Well, right. On Thursday, you're going to see me playing it on my modern cello, because we did all the recording for this at my house at modern pitch, and so I thought I better use a modern. So I used my modern cello for it. But the interesting thing about the modern instrument, even though the equipment is different, that new style bow that we use as string players now, when I say new, it was invented in the early 19th century. That bow is pretty diverse, and as long as you're using the modern equipment correctly, you can get some pretty nice Baroque phrasing on it. You just have to, it's very flexible stuff. Where the Baroque style equipment is a little less flexible, but it does its thing really well. So I played on a modern style instrument, but I'm using Baroque style phrasing. I'm thinking in terms of interpreting the music in an appropriate Baroque style with all the things we've been talking about.
Fabulous. Well, we will then Thursday hear the modern version. This is a recording tonight that, Robert, you recorded up at BYU, Idaho. I don't know the year. I'm sorry.
It was last year, I think. It was just end of 2019.
Well, this is then the first movement of the first cello suite of J.S. Bach, the Prelude, performed by Robert at BYU, Idaho last year. Enjoy. Bravo, bravo, bravo. Lovely. So one of the things there, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you all noticed, Robert is actually holding the cello up with his legs. So when did that go away?
A lack of end pin. Now, all the Baroque cello shares some of the same changes that Emma described really nicely in her video. It's the same differences, except that end pin is an interesting thing that holds the cello on the floor. That was actually a late 19th, early 20th century invention, believe it or not. That even into the Romantic era, cellists preferred to cradle. But now, when you say hold it with your legs, you actually get tired doing that. You're supposed to have your legs kind of in slightly, and it's just supposed to cradle there, and that's how it's supposed to work in theory, right? But yeah, no, they used it, and they went through all the arguments about it. You know, the proponents of the end pin said, "Oh, you need to use this because you can get more sound when it's down on the floor. You can really push into the cello." The guys that preferred the old way said, "Oh no, you're more connected to the instrument. You can move more, and besides, that end pin's going to slip out from under you at some point, and you get so." And yeah, the end. You get used to it. You almost don't notice the difference between the two.
Is that right?
All.
Oh, I would think that. I would think that the convenience of the pin was real, but I mean, we've all seen them slide around, and students have to figure out how to get those things really anchored in there for sure.
Just stomp them on the ground really hard. No, I like playing without an end pin because I am free to move more. The end pin sticks me at one point in the floor, and I like to be able to move physically in combination with what I'm doing. It's a lot freer, less tense way to play. So I actually like not having an end pin. Fabulous. For that kind of reason.
My friends, we are almost out of time. I'm going to see whether there's any behind-the-scenes questions going on our YouTube and Facebook page. But if not, we will, I think we could probably have a couple hours of this conversation. But there's a lot to unpack. I think the takeaways really here are that we have a really excellent program put together for you with all of our musicians staying at home and our excellent team behind the scenes doing the technology to make this possible. And that really this is an exploration of the height of the Baroque period in these different forms, all of these different forms for solo instruments and small ensembles that are just absolutely necessary to be playing right now because of the fact that we are able to explore these different instruments so uniquely and so individually. We're able to, again, perform in a stay-at-home context and still be able to provide this wonderful literature. And as we've talked about here for the past hour, there is a lot of history, style, and so much else to unpack with all of this. So it's really, really rich. We know that our audiences are going to enjoy hearing these performances, and eventually we will get back to the experience of hearing it live in the concert hall. But for now, I'm just thrilled and so grateful for all of you who were able to participate. Just go around one more time. Is there anything else in this conversation that you feel like has been missing, or something else you want to highlight in what we've been chatting about with the Baroque style? I'll put it to you.
I guess the one thing I would say is that I think there's no one correct way. I mean, I think, the more historically informed we are, I think maybe we feel we're giving more authentic performances. But I also think that experimentation and, you listen to recordings, you watch players play, you see a lot of variety of technique. And I think it's important to feel like there's a broad range of interpretation.
I think Emma's right. I think musicians back in that day were as diverse as musicians are now.
Yes.
I love that. And we do strive for that sort of authenticity, and I think that that's really what a performer brings to the table, is their own personal authenticity. You want to be historically accurate and informed, but it's who you are. It comes through. And again, what's amazing is that these works that are now quite old still have this freshness because of the recreation that comes from it, the artistic interpretation, which is very personal and individual. So it's a great way to see who you all are as players. And again, it's a wonderful sort of personal concert on Thursday night. Baroque Elegance. You can get your tickets at ifsymphony.org. I am going to leave it with one very important thing that I've been asked to do, which is for the four of us to give a quick wave. I'm going to take a picture of us and we can put it on the interwebs. So with that, we will say good night and thank you for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Please be in touch anytime with any questions we might be able to answer as a group. We'll do our wave and get a quick photo. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. And with that, we will leave it. Good night. And thank you again, Robert Tueller, Emma Rubinstein, Ellen Marquez. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.